Parasite Eve is an unconventional game, to say the least. It marries survival horror elements to the RPG genre in ways I'm not sure have ever been attempted, either before or since. It's a sequel to a somewhat obscure Japanese science fiction novel, and its plot revolves around a mitochondria uprising. Yes, you heard that right. Mitochondria, the little blob things you learned about in grade 10 biology. So yeah, given all the strangeness, it makes sense to be skeptical of the game's appeal. But over the years, Parasite Eve has earned a devoted cult following, and having finally played it for myself, it's easy to understand why. Developed by Square and released in 1998, Parasite Eve puts players in the shoes of Aya Bree, a New York City police officer with a mysterious past, and also superpowers. But we'll get into that later. The game's story begins at Carnegie Hall on Christmas Eve. Aya and her blind date are there attending an opera when most of the performers and audience spontaneously combust. The lead singer, Melissa, appears to be somehow responsible, and since Aya is one of the few people unaffected, she confronts her on stage. What follows is a series of interconnected episodes that occur over 6 days. The mystery expands in scope as new characters are introduced and the stakes continue to grow. Along the way, you'll get to explore various areas of New York City, recreated with detailed pre-rendered backdrops oozing with atmosphere. The story is good and had me guessing what turns it might take, but the big appeal here are the environments and the tone. Other horror games, like Resident Evil for instance, tend to lean on more traditionally scary iconography. And that's absolutely cool. But Parasite Eve largely takes a different approach. Most of its locations are everyday places that are just a little too empty. The lobby of the recently evacuated St. Francis Hospital, still lit up with its Christmas tree on display, is a great example. Or how every exhibit in the Museum of Natural History looks just a little creepier after dark. In a way, it invokes the internet's relatively recent obsession with liminal spaces. In terms of gameplay, Parasite Eve is both familiar and novel. You'll explore various areas from a third-person perspective, similar to most survival horror games of the time. What's unique, however, are the lack of tank controls. Aya can move in any direction with a flick of the analog stick. It's not really a big deal, I just don't get why the Resident Evil series couldn't or refused to do the same. In general, the game is fairly linear, but those who spend a little more time exploring lockers and behind crates will often be rewarded. Individual areas are connected through a cool 3D map screen with the NYPD HQ serving as your base of operations. Most of the time, as long as you're willing to backtrack, you're free to come and go as you please, leaving one area to explore someplace else. Granted, there isn't a lot of reason to do this. I guess maybe you can look for items you might have missed, but mainly the only times you'll need to stray from your main objective is to visit the police armory or to complete the optional warehouse segment. Before we continue, I need a New York minute to talk about today's sponsor. Gallisto is the trusted marketplace for collectors. It doesn't matter if it's video games, action figures, comics, or cards. If it's collectible, you'll find it on Gallisto. Available through the App Store or Google Play, Gallisto is the perfect tool for both buyers and sellers. Users and listings are always verified, and the service offers some of the lowest selling fees on the market. Not only that, you can use the app to scan collectibles you own or things you're interested in buying. It's a marketplace and an online collection rolled into one. Talk about handy. But hey, don't take my word for it. Head over to Gallisto.com and see for yourself. So what about combat? Well, this is where Parasite Eve really starts to feel like an RPG. Instead of dodging monsters roaming the halls, fights occur randomly with one or more neo-mitochondrial creatures materializing from thin air, and the camera limiting the battle to just a single screen. You can move around freely as long as you don't leave the invisible confines of the arena, but every other action is locked to one of two timers. First, there's the AT, or Active Time Bar, which will replenish faster based on your stats. Once it's maxed out, you can make a move. Maybe you take a shot at an enemy, use an item, or switch guns. Whatever the action, this will set the bar back down to 0. So it's real time, but your abilities are gated. Second is the PE bar. That's not physical education, it's parasite energy. Think of this like a magic meter. As long as the ATB is full, you can use any of your special abilities, assuming you have the required PE. And like the action bar, this one also refills over time, albeit much slower. You'll unlock more parasite powers as you level up, and while some are great, others seem a bit redundant. 5 of the abilities are centered around healing yourself. And while there are situations where you need a quick health boost and can't wait to use Heal 3 or Full Recover, the ramp up in effectiveness between these and the lower level heal abilities means it's always better to wait if you can. Similarly, there's Detox, which allows you to cure poison, and Medic, which cures any status effect, including poison. So again, there is a difference in usefulness, but it's slight. Oh, and then there's Gene Heal, which gradually converts PE into HP for a limited time. I never encountered a situation where this was preferable to Heal 3, which immediately restores 280 HP for almost the same PE cost. When listing these abilities, it's clear to me that they're far too reliant on recovering HP or removing status effects. And there's only a few that actually grant interesting buffs. Haste increases your real-time movement speed and is super useful. Barrier converts PE into shield energy, and Energy Shot is an effective tool early in the game that allows you to deliver a powerful blow at the cost of a brief period of exhaustion. My absolute favorite ability, and this will come as no surprise to anyone who's played the game, is Liberate, the last one you unlock. It uses your entire PE bar and allows Aya to transform into a mitochondrial creature to inflict multiple powerful attacks. If a boss is sufficiently damaged beforehand, and you use Liberate at the right time, you can sometimes end a fight very quickly. Anyway, file this under nitpicks, but as much as I like the underlying system, the abilities themselves feel somewhat half-baked. This, I think, is an area where a modern remake could make some slight improvements by cutting back on healing options and replacing them with more creative tools for the player to experiment with. Next, let's talk about guns. At a glance, you might not think there's much to say, but this is another area where the RPG elements take center stage. Expect less focus on resource scarcity and more on stats. Glorious stats. Guns fall into basic archetypes, which include all the usual suspects: pistols, rifles, grenade launchers. You get the idea. These will all lean a certain way in terms of base stats, but there's also variation between different guns of the same type. You might want something with a high attack stat, which, as you might have guessed, means it does more damage. But this often comes with its own drawbacks, so maybe instead you'll focus on ammo carrying capacity or rate of fire. It all comes down to preference, although some guns do seem to remain viable longer than others. Personally, I tended to favor range. This is represented in battle by a big green dome. Your accuracy is greater if enemies fall within this area. Since it's usually a smart tactic to space yourself from enemy attacks, this seemed important to me. Then again, there were definitely situations where I was forced to move in closer, in which case something like a shotgun might be more effective. In addition to all of this, you can also find power-ups to boost individual stats, and weapons will have unique bonuses which can be transferred to other weapons using consumable tools. To be completely honest, this system confused me. I mostly just kept modifying a single decent rifle, and that served me well right until the final boss. Either the difficulty spiked massively, or I made a terrible mistake. Regardless, I resolved the situation by completing the optional warehouse area. By this point, I was super overleveled, so the place was a breeze. But for some reason, the rocket launcher at the end, with its base stats, was more effective than the gun I'd spent the whole game tweaking. Needless to say, RPGs are not my thing. I'm sure others will have far more fun and success playing around with these systems. But it's worth mentioning how it's possible to succeed, even with a very loose understanding. As far as I'm concerned, that's a plus. Trust me, I want to try to lay it all out, but at the end of the day, don't worry too much. The game is designed to be accessible for all kinds of players. The only situations where your weapon and armor stats will really come into play is during boss battles. And even then, the real-time aspect means that knowing how to avoid damage is just as effective as bringing the right tools. In general, the bosses are super fun and a total highlight. This is where Parasite Eve's many mechanics really begin to gel. You're always watching those two bars, debating whether to heal with PE or if you should use a medicine item instead and save your parasite powers for special moves or a temporary debuff. Bosses generally come at you with a number of varied attacks. Some are easy to dodge and others random. And with sweeping moves, even imperfect positioning can be the difference between partial and maximum damage. Also, some bosses have multiple target points, and focusing on just one can sometimes make fights easier. The other thing you can do to assist you during battles is to save inventory items for when you really need them. This is kind of a no-brainer, but unless you're leveling up your carrying capacity, you might find yourself leaving behind a lot of good stuff. It's important to make frequent stops at the police station to drop off weapons you're not using and store extra healing items. In this way, I suppose a bit of that survival horror DNA begins to show. Graphically, I think Parasite Eve remains fairly effective. Due to the technical limitations of the original PlayStation hardware, it does look pixelated and blurry in spots, but I think the art design and clever use of forced camera still allow for some genuine wow moments. Coupled with the moody and memorable soundtrack, it scores high in the presentation categories. Parasite Eve is not something you can pick up and immediately grasp, but it introduces new concepts at a steady enough pace, generally explaining them with decent clarity. And as I said, it's balanced in such a way that even less experienced players can make their way through its brisk but satisfying 10-hour campaign without much trouble. In addition, for those who just can't get enough, there's also a decent amount of post-game content in the form of the Chrysler Building. Unlocked after completing the main game, this is a massive 70-floor endurance dungeon made up of randomly generated mazes crawling with monsters. You'll collect tons of great loot along the way and face stronger versions of previously defeated bosses. Writing this review on Parasite Eve has been an interesting process. I never really saw much overlap between survival horror and RPG mechanics, but this one really does blur the line and shows just how deceptively similar they can be. So if you're a fan of either genre, this is seriously a must-play title. And for all you neo-mitochondrial creatures out there, Happy New Year.